A weekend. That's all I'm asking. Just 2 days. Pretend you're my date, and when Monday comes, you'll never have to see me again." The words hung in the warm afternoon air like they didn't belong in Ethan Walker's tiny woodworking shop, where the scent of fresh-cut cedar drifted through open windows and golden sunlight settled across sawdust-covered floors. Ethan looked up from the rocking chair he had been sanding, blinking once as though he had misheard the elegant woman standing in the doorway. She wore a simple navy dress, comfortable walking shoes, and no jewelry except a silver watch that looked old enough to carry memories. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that hinted at extraordinary wealth. She looked tired more than anything else, like someone carrying responsibilities too heavy to set down. "You don't even know me," Ethan said quietly, brushing sawdust from his hands. She offered a small smile that never quite reached her eyes. "That's exactly why I came here." Outside, an old pickup truck sat beneath the shade of a maple tree. Inside the shop, every shelf told the story of a man who had traded bigger dreams for a quieter purpose. Handcrafted bookshelves, rocking horses, and dining tables filled the room with the kind of honest work that never made headlines, but somehow made houses feel like homes. Ethan glanced toward a framed photograph resting beside his toolbox. A little girl with bright blue eyes wrapped both arms around his neck, laughing so hard that her smile blurred in the picture. His daughter, Lily, 8 years old. His whole world. "Daddy," her cheerful voice called from the back room. "Did you finish Mrs. Porter's birdhouse?" Ethan smiled before answering. "Almost, sweetheart." The woman watched the exchange in silence, and something softened behind her composed expression. She noticed the lunchbox decorated with cartoon butterflies, the stack of children's library books, and the calendar filled with school events instead of business meetings. This wasn't just a carpenter's shop. It was a father's life built one careful day at a time. "I can pay you," she said gently. Ethan shook his head before she even finished the sentence. "If money's the reason you think I'll say yes, you've got the wrong guy." She lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed. "I was hoping that wasn't the reason." The room became still except for the slow hum of an aging ceiling fan. Somewhere outside, a wind chime danced softly beneath the porch roof. Ethan studied her face, searching for signs of dishonesty, but found only exhaustion and a quiet sadness he recognized all too well. He had seen that same expression in his own mirror after losing the woman he loved years earlier. "Why me?" he finally asked. She hesitated just long enough to tell him the answer mattered. "Because everyone else already wants something from me." Ethan looked toward his daughter's photograph one more time before taking a slow breath. "All right," he said. "One weekend. That's all." Relief washed across the stranger's face so suddenly that it almost looked like hope returning after a very long absence. She extended her hand. "I'm Olivia." Ethan accepted it with a polite smile. "Ethan." Neither of them noticed the black helicopter waiting quietly behind a distant line of trees, its engines already warming for departure, or the discreet security team watching from parked SUVs hidden beyond the hill. Ethan believed he had simply agreed to help a lonely woman through an uncomfortable family gathering. He had no idea the woman standing in his workshop wasn't just another traveler passing through town. By the time the weekend ended, he would discover that Olivia Bennett wasn't visiting a millionaire CEO. She was the millionaire CEO everyone else had been waiting for. Saturday morning arrived beneath a pale blue sky brushed with thin clouds as Ethan locked the door of his workshop and slipped his worn duffel bag into the trunk of a dark luxury sedan waiting beside the curb. He paused for a moment when Lily wrapped her arms around his waist. "You are really going?" she asked with a hopeful smile. Ethan knelt until they were eye level. "Only for the weekend. Mrs. Porter will stay with you, and I will be back before your spelling test on Monday." Lily grinned. "Do not forget you promised pancakes." "I never break pancake promises," he said, gently, tapping the end of her nose. Olivia watched quietly from beside the car, noticing how naturally every word between father and daughter carried warmth instead of obligation. There were no expensive gifts, no dramatic speeches, only quiet trust built over years of ordinary mornings. As they pulled onto the highway, silence settled comfortably between them. Cornfields rolled across the countryside while old red barns and weathered fences stretched toward distant hills. Ethan rested one arm against the window, admiring the changing landscape. "So," he finally said with a small smile, "what exactly am I walking into?" Olivia kept her eyes on the road. A family gathering. That sounds harmless enough. She laughed softly, although there was little humor in it. You have never met my family. Ethan nodded without pressing further. He had learned long ago that people revealed their hardest stories only after they felt safe enough to tell them. Nearly 3 hours later, the peaceful highways gave way to broad, tree-lined boulevards leading toward an elegant lakeside resort. Perfectly trimmed gardens surrounded stone buildings covered in climbing ivy. A fountain sparkled beneath the afternoon sun while valets welcomed arriving guests with polished smiles. Ethan stepped out of the sedan and quietly whistled. This place must cost more per night than I earn in a month. Olivia looked almost uncomfortable. Probably. Before Ethan could answer, 3 attendants hurried toward them. Good afternoon, Miss Bennett, one of them said respectfully. Ethan barely noticed the greeting because he assumed they recognized her from previous visits. Olivia responded with a polite nod before introducing Ethan simply as her guest. They entered the grand lobby where sunlight poured through towering glass windows onto polished marble floors. A pianist played gentle jazz near the fireplace while families laughed over late lunches and children chased one another through the courtyard beyond the terrace. Ethan smiled as he watched a little boy struggle to tie his sneaker. Without hesitation, he crouched beside him. May I help? The child's mother thanked him warmly while Ethan finished the not with patient hands. Olivia observed the brief exchange from several feet away. He never looked around to see who was watching. He never tried to impress anyone. Kindness seemed to arrive as naturally as breathing. As they reached the elevator, a sharply dressed businessman glanced at Ethan's faded boots before leaning toward another guest with a quiet smirk. Interesting choice, he muttered under his breath. Ethan either did not hear the remark or chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, he held the elevator door open for an elderly couple carrying heavy travel bags. The woman smiled gratefully. Young man, your parents raised you well. Ethan answered with the same gentle humility that had shaped every moment of his life. They tried their best, ma'am. Olivia lowered her eyes, hiding a thoughtful smile. For the first time in many years, she wondered if the strongest person in the room might also be the one asking for absolutely nothing in return. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor with a quiet chime, revealing a hallway lined with fresh white roses, polished walnut walls, and framed black and white photographs of generations who had built fortunes long before most people in the town had been born. Ethan adjusted the sleeve of his clean blue shirt, suddenly aware that nearly everyone passing by wore custom-tailored suits or elegant designer dresses. He smiled anyway. Clothes had never measured character in his experience. Olivia stopped outside a pair of carved wooden doors and took a slow breath before looking at him. There is one thing I should probably tell you, she said softly. Ethan tilted his head. Your family does not approve? She laughed under her breath. That might be the understatement of the year. Before he could answer, the door swung open. A cheerful woman in her 60s hurried forward with open arms. Olivia, finally. She embraced her warmly before noticing Ethan. Her smile remained polite but uncertain. And this must be your guest. Ethan extended his hand. Ethan Walker. It is nice to meet you, ma'am. She returned the handshake, studying his calloused hands for a brief second before introducing herself as Margaret Bennett. Around the spacious room, conversation slowed almost immediately. Crystal chandeliers reflected across tall windows overlooking the lake, while servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling water and small appetizers. One by one, curious eyes settled on Ethan. Some smiled. Others quietly whispered behind lifted glasses. So that is him? One voice murmured. He looks like a contractor. Maybe he owns a construction company. I doubt it. Look at those boots. Ethan caught fragments of the comments without reacting. Years of raising Lily had taught him that not every opinion deserved an answer. Olivia noticed every glance, every whisper. Her shoulders tightened. She had expected skepticism, but seeing it unfold around someone who had done nothing except show kindness left a quiet ache in her chest. A tall man wearing an expensive charcoal suit approached with effortless confidence. Olivia, he said smoothly before turning toward Ethan. Daniel Prescott. His handshake was firm, almost competitive. And what line of business are you in, Ethan? I build furniture. Daniel waited, clearly expecting more. Custom furniture? Mostly. How many employees? Ethan smiled. Usually just me. A few nearby guests exchanged restrained smiles. Daniel nodded politely, though disappointment flickered across his face. Interesting, Ethan simply asked. And what do you enjoy building? The unexpected question caught Daniel completely off guard. Excuse me. You asked about my work. I thought I would ask about yours. Daniel hesitated before admitting, corporate acquisitions. Ethan nodded with genuine curiosity. That sounds challenging. I hope it still leaves time for the people you love. Silence settled between them. Daniel looked away first, pretending to notice someone across the room. Olivia watched the exchange with growing surprise. Ethan had not embarrassed him. He had not competed with him. He had simply asked the one question money could not answer. As dinner was announced, guests moved toward the grand dining room overlooking the water. A young server carrying a tray stumbled slightly when one glass tipped dangerously toward the polished floor. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan stepped forward, catching the tray with steady hands before anything spilled. Easy, he said warmly. Everybody has long days. The relieved server whispered, Thank you, sir. Several guests who had been whispering only moments earlier fell unexpectedly quiet. Olivia noticed something beginning to change. Respect rarely arrived with applause. Sometimes it entered a room as softly as a single act of grace that no one could honestly criticize. The evening settled over the lakeside resort with soft amber light reflecting across the water as conversations drifted between polished tables covered in white linen and fresh flowers. Laughter echoed gently beneath the chandeliers, but Ethan noticed something different from the moment dinner began. Every conversation seemed to carry an invisible question. Who was he? And why had Olivia brought him here? He did not pretend not to notice. He simply refused to let curiosity or judgment decide the kind of man he would be. As the first course was served, Margaret Bennett welcomed everyone with a warm smile. This weekend has always been about family, gratitude, and new beginnings. Glasses lifted around the room. Ethan quietly raised his own glass of sparkling water. Beside him, Olivia noticed that he listened more than he spoke, never interrupting, never trying to become the center of attention. Halfway through dinner, a nervous young server accidentally placed the wrong entree in front of one of the guests. Before the embarrassed employee could apologize, the guest sighed dramatically. Can anyone here do anything correctly? The young man's face turned pale. Ethan spoke before anyone else could. Actually, that one is mine. The server looked confused. Sir, I am so sorry. Ethan smiled kindly. No need. I was thinking about trying something different anyway. The guest accepted the replacement without another word, believing the mistake had been harmless. As the server quietly thanked Ethan moments later, he whispered, You saved my job. Ethan simply replied, No, you earned it. Everybody deserves a little grace on a busy night. Olivia heard every word. Across the room, Daniel Prescott watched the exchange with folded arms, unable to understand why someone would accept inconvenience without expecting recognition. After dinner, guests gathered outside beneath strings of glowing lights stretched between ancient oak trees overlooking the lake. A local jazz trio began playing familiar American classics while children chased fireflies across the lawn. Near the stone patio, an elderly man struggled to unfold a heavy wooden wheelchair ramp leading toward the garden path. Ethan crossed the lawn before anyone called for help. May I give you a hand? The older gentleman smiled with relief. These hinges get heavier every year. Together they lifted the ramp into place. The man's wife rolled forward in her wheelchair and squeezed Ethan's hand. Thank you, young man. Ethan answered with his usual quiet warmth. My father always told me that if something is heavy for one person, it becomes lighter when two people carry it. Olivia remained several steps away, watching him disappear naturally into moments where nobody important seemed to be watching. Or so he believed. From an upstairs balcony, several members of her family observed everything. He keeps helping people, one cousin remarked. Another shrugged. Maybe he is trying to impress Olivia. Margaret slowly shook her head. No. Watch carefully. He helps when Olivia is not even nearby. Silence followed. For the first time that evening, the conversation changed. They were no longer discussing Ethan's clothes or his profession. They were discussing his character. Olivia leaned quietly against the terrace railing, listening to distant laughter carried across the lake by the evening breeze. The expensive suits, luxury cars, and impressive titles surrounding her suddenly felt strangely small beside a man who measured success by how many burdens he could quietly lift from someone else's shoulders. Without realizing it, Ethan was passing every test no one had admitted they were giving him. And the people who had first measured his worth by his boots were slowly beginning to discover that dignity leaves footprints far deeper than wealth ever can. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in a quiet mist that drifted across the lake like a soft gray blanket while the first rays of sunlight painted the water with streaks of gold. Most of the guests were still asleep after the previous night's celebration, but Ethan had always been an early riser. He slipped out of the resort carrying a paper cup of black coffee and wandered toward the wooden dock where the only sounds were gentle waves brushing against old pilings and birds greeting the new day. A maintenance worker struggled nearby with a loose section of railing that had splintered during the recent storms. Ethan set down his coffee without saying a word. "Would you mind holding that board for a minute?" he asked. The man looked surprised. "You know how to fix this?" Ethan smiled. "Wood has been paying my bills for a long time." Within 15 minutes, the railing stood straight again. The worker reached into his pocket. "At least let me pay you." Ethan shook his head. "Just promise somebody else the same kindness when they need it." Unknown to Ethan, Olivia had been watching from the balcony outside her suite. She had come looking for a quiet place to think before breakfast, but instead she found herself watching the man she had hired for one weekend repairing something that no one had asked him to touch. There were no cameras, no audience, no reward, only a habit of leaving places a little better than he found them. Later that morning, the family gathered for a charity brunch held in the resort garden. Local children from a nearby community music program had been invited to perform before the fundraising auction began. One little girl froze halfway to the small stage, clutching her violin with trembling hands. Tears gathered in her eyes as dozens of strangers waited politely. Ethan quietly stepped away from his table and walked toward the nervous child. He knelt beside her until they were the same height. "Do you know what my daughter tells me before every school recital?" The little girl slowly shook her head. "She says butterflies in your stomach are just excitement trying to find its wings." The child smiled through her tears. "Does it work?" Ethan nodded. "Every single time." A few moments later, the little girl lifted her violin beneath her chin and played with growing confidence. When the final note faded into the warm spring air, applause filled the garden. Ethan had already returned to his seat before anyone noticed where he had gone. Olivia looked at him differently now. She remembered the powerful men she had dated over the years. Some had measured life by stock prices, others by headlines or private jets. Yet none of them had ever paused a conversation worth millions of dollars to comfort one frightened child. As the auction began, Daniel Prescott approached Olivia with an amused smile. "Your carpenter is becoming quite popular." Olivia answered without taking her eyes off Ethan. "His name is Ethan." Daniel shrugged. "People like simple stories." Olivia spoke quietly, almost to herself. "No, people recognized genuine ones." Across the lawn, Ethan laughed as an elderly guest challenged him to a game of horseshoes. His smile was effortless, unguarded, and completely unaware that he had become the subject of every conversation among the Bennett family. Margaret watched him from beneath the shade of an old oak tree before turning toward her brother. "Do you see it now?" she asked softly. "He has spent less than 24 hours with us, and not once has he asked Olivia about her money, her business, or her influence." Her brother nodded slowly. "Perhaps because he already has everything he believes matters." Olivia lowered her eyes as those words settled deeply inside her heart, because for the first time in many years, she found herself wondering whether the richest person she had ever met was the man who owned the very least. The charity brunch ended just after noon, but the atmosphere around the resort shifted almost immediately. Luxury sedans began arriving one after another, their polished black exteriors reflecting the afternoon sun as security personnel quietly took their positions near the entrance. Guests who had spent the morning laughing beside the lake suddenly straightened their jackets and checked their phones. Something important was about to happen. Ethan noticed the change but remained calm. He assumed another business meeting had been added to the family's busy schedule. Olivia walked beside him through the marble lobby, her expression growing more thoughtful with every step. Before she could explain anything, Daniel Prescott approached with an easy smile that carried more confidence than warmth. The board members are already here, he said while looking directly at Olivia. Everyone is waiting. She nodded once. I will be there in a moment. Daniel's eyes drifted toward Ethan. Unfortunately, this part of the afternoon is reserved for executives. Ethan answered with his usual quiet courtesy. That makes sense. I can find somewhere to read until you are finished. Olivia started to object, but Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. Do not worry. You have responsibilities. Daniel watched the exchange before saying, there is something you should probably know before you wander around. His voice became just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The woman you came here with is not simply attending this meeting. Ethan looked at him with polite curiosity. Daniel folded his hands behind his back. Olivia Bennett owns Bennett Technologies. She is the Chief Executive Officer. She controls a company worth several $billion. Every executive inside that ballroom answers to her. The lobby fell completely still. Conversation stopped. Even the pianist in the corner paused between songs. Several family members quietly turned toward Ethan, waiting for surprise, excitement, or perhaps ambition to appear across his face. Olivia held her breath. For the first time all weekend, she looked genuinely nervous. Ethan blinked once. Then he smiled with the same gentle expression he had worn since stepping into the resort. I wondered why everyone seemed so careful around you, he said softly. Daniel frowned, almost disappointed. That is all you have to say? Ethan shrugged lightly. Should I say something different? Daniel let out a quiet laugh. Most people would be shocked. Ethan looked toward Olivia. You asked me to spend a weekend helping someone through a difficult family gathering. That is exactly what I agreed to do. Olivia searched his eyes. You are not upset that I did not tell you? Ethan answered. Honestly, your job is part of your life. It is not your entire identity. I wanted to know the person, not the title. Silence settled over the lobby once again, but this time it felt different. Margaret Bennett lowered her eyes with a thoughtful smile. One of the older board members quietly removed his glasses as though trying to see Ethan more clearly. Daniel crossed his arms, unable to understand how someone standing before unimaginable wealth could remain completely unchanged. Olivia felt something inside her heart begin to shift. Every relationship she had ever known had changed the moment people discovered who she was. Some became impressed. Others became intimidated. Many became calculating. Ethan became none of those things. He simply opened the ballroom door for her with the same quiet respect he had shown the elderly couple, the frightened child, and the exhausted server. After you, he said. As Olivia stepped inside to face the leaders of her company, she realized the greatest surprise of the weekend was not that Ethan had learned she was one of the most powerful women in the room. It was that learning the truth had not changed the way he looked at her even a little. The board meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, and by the time the final presentation ended, the afternoon sun had begun sinking toward the western hills beyond the lake. Executives slowly filtered out of the ballroom, speaking in low voices about quarterly forecasts and future expansion, yet one topic quietly replaced every financial report. They were all talking about the man who had remained exactly the same after learning who Olivia truly was. Ethan had spent those hours sitting on a shaded bench overlooking the water with a borrowed novel from the resort library, occasionally waving to families strolling along the shoreline, and helping a little boy retrieve a toy sailboat that had drifted too far from the dock. When Olivia finally stepped outside, she found him feeding small pieces of bread to a pair of ducks while laughing with 2 elderly guests he had met only minutes earlier. I hope I did not keep you waiting, she said. Ethan closed the book and smiled. You looked like you had important work to do. She sat beside him, unusually quiet. The breeze carried the scent of fresh pine and lake water, while distant church bells echoed across the valley. Most people change after they learn who I am, Olivia admitted. Some become nervous. Others suddenly become very interested in everything I say. Ethan looked across the calm water before answering. That sounds lonely. She lowered her eyes. It is. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Sometimes silence carried more honesty than conversation. Finally, Olivia turned toward him. Would you consider something that is no longer part of our agreement? Ethan smiled gently. What is it? She took a slow breath. Stay longer. Not because I hired you. Because I want to know you. Ethan's expression remained warm, but thoughtful. Olivia, you deserve someone who belongs in your world. She shook her head almost immediately. What if I am tired of that world? Ethan rested his hands together and chose his words carefully, just as he always did when speaking to Lily. Your world has responsibilities that reach thousands of employees and families. Mine begins with making pancakes on Monday morning before my daughter goes to school. I cannot pretend those lives are the same. Olivia looked away, blinking back unexpected emotion. You think I care about how much money you have? No, Ethan answered softly. I think other people expect me to. At that moment, Margaret Bennett approached quietly along the stone path. She had clearly heard enough to understand the conversation without interrupting it. Ethan, she said warmly, may I ask you one question? He stood respectfully. Of course. She smiled with the kindness of a mother who had spent decades watching people misunderstand what truly mattered. If Olivia had told you on the first day exactly who she was, would you still have agreed to come? Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. Margaret tilted her head. Why? Ethan looked toward the lake where the evening sunlight shimmered across the gentle waves. Because she did not ask me to admire her success. She asked me to help carry something that was making her heart heavy. My father taught me a long time ago that when someone trusts you with a burden, you do not ask how much money they have before deciding whether to help. Margaret smiled through glistening eyes. Olivia quietly covered her mouth, unable to hide the emotion rising inside her. Around them, the evening breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and for a brief moment the busy resort seemed to fall perfectly still. No applause followed. No grand announcement interrupted the silence. Yet every person standing nearby understood that they had just witnessed something rare. Character had spoken in the simplest words possible, and somehow those quiet words carried more weight than every impressive title discussed inside the boardroom only moments before. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air as Ethan loaded his small toolbox into the back of his pickup truck before driving home from the resort. The quiet country roads felt familiar again, lined with old fences, golden fields, and the simple rhythm of everyday life. By 8 o'clock, he was standing in his kitchen flipping pancakes while Lily sat at the table coloring a picture of a little cabin beside a lake. Did your trip go well? She asked with syrup already on the corner of her smile. Ethan chuckled. It was interesting. Lily looked up. Did you make a new friend? He paused for just a second before answering. Yes, I think I did. Nearly 200 miles away, Olivia sat alone inside the executive conference room at Bennett Technologies. The polished walnut table was surrounded by senior vice presidents discussing acquisitions, investment strategies, and market forecasts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet her attention drifted somewhere entirely different. She remembered Ethan repairing the broken railing before sunrise. She remembered him comforting the frightened violin player. She remembered the way he had opened every door, thanked every employee, and treated every stranger with the same quiet respect. Finally, she closed the presentation folder in front of her. Reschedule the afternoon meetings, she said calmly. Several executives looked up in surprise. Daniel Prescott frowned. We have investors flying in from Chicago. Olivia nodded. They can meet with the board tomorrow. Daniel hesitated. May I ask where you are going? Olivia smiled for the first time that morning. To visit someone who never asked where I was going. 3 hours later, a silver SUV rolled slowly into Ethan's small town beneath a bright blue sky. There were no security vehicles behind it, no assistants, no photographers. Only Olivia sitting quietly behind the wheel wearing blue jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a light sweater. She parked outside the woodworking shop just as children were leaving school across the street. Ethan looked up from sanding a cedar bench and smiled with genuine surprise. I thought you would be in another board meeting. Olivia laughed softly. I thought you would still believe every weekend has to end on Sunday. Before Ethan could answer, Lily burst through the front door, carrying her backpack. She stopped when she recognized Olivia and smiled without hesitation. You came back. Olivia knelt beside her. I hope that is all right. Lily nodded enthusiastically. Daddy says people who keep their promises are always welcome. Ethan looked at his daughter before quietly shaking his head with an affectionate smile. I really did say that. Lily reached for Olivia's hand. Do you want to see my treehouse? Olivia glanced toward Ethan for permission. He simply smiled. If she is offering the grand tour, that is a very special invitation. The three of them walked into the backyard where a modest wooden treehouse stood beneath a large maple tree with a handmade rope swing hanging beside it. The paint was faded. The steps had been repaired more than once. Yet laughter filled the yard more completely than any grand ballroom at the resort. Olivia watched Ethan push Lily gently on the swing, while autumn leaves floated through the afternoon sunlight. No assistants interrupted them. No one cared about quarterly earnings. No one whispered about status or titles. There were only simple moments stitched together by kindness, patience, and love. As Lily ran ahead, chasing a bright red leaf across the grass, Olivia quietly turned toward Ethan. "I spent years building a company," she said softly, "but I forgot how to build a life." Ethan looked toward his daughter before answering with the same quiet honesty that had guided him through every moment of the weekend. The beautiful thing about life is that it lets us start building again whenever we choose. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the maple branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance church bells echoed across the small town. This time the silence between them did not feel uncertain. It felt like the beginning of something that neither money nor success could ever buy. 1 year later, the first Saturday of autumn arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky as golden leaves drifted across the same quiet street where Ethan's woodworking shop welcomed another ordinary morning. The smell of fresh cedar filled the air while laughter floated from the backyard where Lily carefully added a final coat of paint to a small birdhouse she had built with her father. Life had changed, but not in the way most people would have imagined. Ethan still drove the same pickup truck. He still repaired tables, built rocking chairs, and greeted every customer by name. Olivia still led Bennett Technologies, still traveled across the country, and still carried responsibilities that affected thousands of families. Yet every Friday evening, whenever her schedule allowed, a silver SUV appeared outside the little workshop without cameras, without headlines, and without anyone announcing her arrival. She never came to escape her life anymore. She came because she had finally found a place where she could simply live it. That afternoon, the town hosted its annual community fair in the park. Children raced between homemade games while local musicians played beneath colorful banners. Ethan had donated a handcrafted bench for the charity raffle, and Lily proudly handed out homemade cookies beside a small table decorated with hand-painted signs. Olivia stood beside them wearing blue jeans and a simple sweater, laughing as though she had known the neighbors her entire life. An elderly woman smiled warmly before whispering to another volunteer, "They look like they have always belonged together." Margaret Bennett, who had quietly driven into town earlier that morning, overheard the comment and smiled to herself. She walked toward Ethan carrying a small wrapped package. "I have something for you," she said. Ethan accepted it politely before opening the box. Inside rested an old black and white photograph of Olivia's late father standing in a modest woodworking shop as a young man, smiling beside a handmade table. Ethan looked up in surprise. Margaret nodded gently. Before he built the company, he built furniture with his own hands. Success changed his address, but it never changed his heart. "I think he would have liked you very much." Ethan carefully held the photograph as though it were something priceless. "Thank you," he said quietly. Olivia slipped her hand into his, not because anyone was watching, but because it finally felt like the most natural place in the world for it to rest. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the park, Lily won first prize for her little birdhouse. She ran toward Ethan and Olivia with joyful excitement. "We all built it together," she announced proudly before placing the blue ribbon across the front of the birdhouse instead of around her own neck. Ethan laughed softly. "Why did you do that?" Lily looked at both of them with complete innocence. "Because homes are more important than prizes." The words settled gently over everyone standing nearby. No one rushed to speak. No one tried to improve what had already been perfectly said. Olivia looked toward Ethan, her eyes bright with quiet gratitude. A year earlier, she had believed she needed someone willing to fit into her extraordinary world. Instead, she discovered that the greatest miracle was finding someone whose ordinary life reminded her what extraordinary truly meant. The evening sun dipped below the maple trees as families packed picnic blankets and children chased the last fireflies of the season across the grass. Ethan wrapped one arm around Lily while Olivia walked beside them, matching their easy pace without hurry. Wealth had not rescued love. Power had not earned respect. Titles had not built trust. Quiet kindness had done all three. And somewhere between a simple promise made for one weekend and 1,000 ordinary moments that followed, 3 lives had found something far greater than success. They had found a home where dignity was treasured, second chances were welcomed, and love never needed to announce itself because the deepest truths are often spoken best in gentle silence.